Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
You are a very tough act to follow.
Order, order. I invite the House to rise and observe a minute's silence in memory of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Order. We now come to the main business. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I begin by moving and reading the humble address. I beg to move that an humble address be presented to Her Majesty, expressing the deep sympathies and condolences of this House on the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, whose life was given unstintingly in devoted public service to the country and the Commonwealth, who with his late Majesty, King George VI, rallied the nation in the darkest days of war and who in times of peace was a unifying figure for Britain, inspiring love and affection in all she met. On Friday, her coffin will be carried in a ceremonial procession to Westminster Hall, where it will lie in state until the evening of Monday, 8th of April. Members of the public will be able to pay their respects there prior to the funeral, which will then take place at 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, 9th of April, in Westminster Abbey. Mr. Speaker, sir, I know that the whole House will join with me in paying tribute to the Queen Mother, who for almost a century was part of our lives, inspired our country, aroused its respect and affection, and for whose service and life we give our most profound thanks. Part of the fascination with the Queen Mother was undoubtedly the sheer span of history she encompassed. Not just the great events of the 20th century, its wars, the ideologies that came and went, but its technological and scientific discoveries, its vastly changing culture. 1801 compared to 1701 was no doubt very different. But 2001 compared to 1901 seems an historic age apart. And yet she sought and experienced it all. She was born during the Boer War, in an era virtually free from the motor car, a time when she once remembered a dairyman still often stood with his cows selling milk near the gates of Buckingham Palace. Yet at the end of her life, thousands of people sent emails of condolence to the royal website. During that long life, the Titanic sailed and sank when she was 11. World War I broke out on her 14th birthday. Her first child was born in 1926, the year that television was invented. She was the last Empress of India. In 1986, she became the oldest person to bear the title of Queen in the history of the British monarchy. And in all, she saw 20 different prime ministers pass through Downing Street. One of my best memories of her personally is sitting with her at Balmoral, as she told me of her personal recollections, not just of Churchill and Attlee, but of Asquith, Lloyd George and Baldwin. Undoubtedly, this long perspective brought stability to the monarchy and to the country. But the respect she received, the outpouring of affection accorded her death, is not the result, simply or even principally, of her long life. She could have lived over 100 years and made little mark. The tributes could have been a ritual, but they weren't. They were genuine and heartfelt, and from young and old, from all classes, all backgrounds, all walks of life. And that was because of the person that she was, not the rank that she held. She came to embody what was best about our past and makes us most optimistic about our future. For herself, she never expected to become queen, despite being told apparently that she would be by a fortune teller as a child. It was only after the abdication of King Edward VIII that her husband became King George VI. In 1936, during the abdication crisis, she wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury that, "I can hardly believe that we have been called to this tremendous task. The curious thing is that we are not afraid." Her husband had seen active service in the Navy. She had never anticipated the role of queen. Both, therefore, had led lives reasonably broad in experience and in meeting people. And the war was to prove that fate had chosen well for Britain. Hitler, it is said, watching a newsreel clip of her laying a poppy at a First World War memorial and noticing her poise and spirit, is said to have dubbed her the most dangerous woman in Europe, at least for him. King George and Queen Elizabeth rallied the nation magnificently during the war's worst hours and days. Her refusal to leave London is now legendary. A clue as to why, however, can be found in what she wrote at the time after visiting the East End. She said, "I feel quite exhausted after seeing and hearing so much sadness, sorrow, heroism, and magnificent spirit. The destruction is so awful and the people so wonderful. They deserve a better world." She spent nights in air raid shelters and took up revolver shooting lessons in the grounds of the palace. And so her spirit and the British spirit became inseparably intertwined. She was a unifying figure too, because she personified the diversity and unity of Britain and the Commonwealth. She considered herself a Scot and was proud of it. A descendant of Scottish royalty, she spent a lot of time from an early age at her family's estates in Scotland. She was never happier than when at her home at the Castle of May in Caithness, or fly fishing in Scotland's rivers. During a visit to South Africa in 1946, she met an old Boer veteran who told her bitterly, "I can never forgive what the English did to my people." "Not at all put out," the Queen replied. "Oh, I do so understand. We in Scotland often feel just the same." In all her work, she was motivated by the most powerful sense of duty and service. She believed that the royal family's duty was to serve the nation, and she carried out that role with total and selfless devotion, even after she had suffered the loss of her beloved husband. She was still carrying out 130 engagements a year at the age of 80, and even over 50 at the age of 100. She has been involved often as patron or president in well over 300 charities, voluntary bodies and other organisations. She served the British Legion, for example, throughout almost its whole existence, nearly 80 years. We should remember her also, however, for her great sense of fun and her zest for life. Her enthusiasm and her humour shone through in all she did, whether handing out shamrocks to the Irish Guards on St. Patrick's Day, inspecting the Chelsea pensioners, or indulging her lifelong and very serious passion for horse racing. Her infectious sense of fun could charm even opponents. The veteran anti-monarchist and former Member of Parliament, Willie Hamilton, said on her 80th birthday, "I am glad to salute a remarkable old lady. Long may she live to be the pride of her family, and may God understand and forgive me if I've been ensnared and corrupted, if only briefly, by this superb old trooper." Not only did she enjoy life to the full, she helped others to do so. Her longevity, her vitality in old age gave hope to older people everywhere. And commenting on her extraordinary vigour and gaiety, she was still dancing well into her 90s, She once said, "I love life. That's my secret." As His Royal Highness Prince Charles has said, she was the original life enhancer, gloriously unstoppable. So, Mr. Speaker, today our thoughts and prayers are with all the royal family, and especially with Her Majesty the Queen, who has in the space of a few weeks so cruelly suffered the loss of both her sister and mother. The Queen has borne it with her customary dignity, continuing to serve the nation even whilst grieving. And, Mr. Speaker, we have seen in the very many moving and memorable tributes that have been paid to Her Majesty the Queen Mother, the recurring themes of her love of life, her warmth and humour, her love of country, and above all, her devotion to duty. It is the belief in duty that catches her spirit best. Yet it is not duty in an arid or formal sense. She enjoyed life, lived it, and loved it to the full. But she showed how it could be lived and loved whilst not for one moment compromising her commitment to duty. It is that combination of high integrity and simple humanity that made her not just respected, but loved. There is nothing false or complicated about the public response to her death. It is the simplest of equations. She loved her country, and in turn her country loved her. And for that, and for her long life of service and devotion, we earnestly give our thanks and praise.
Order. The question is that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye. Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, in supporting the humble address, all of us on this side of the House concur entirely with the tribute the Prime Minister has paid to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Our thoughts and prayers, as he has already said, are with Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family, particularly because in this, her Golden Jubilee year, Her Majesty has had to suffer the death of her sister and now her mother within a matter of weeks, a personal tragedy. 50 years ago, Sir Winston Churchill stood in the Right Honourable Gentleman's place as the House gathered to mourn the death of the King. He said of the King during the last war, and I quote, "The fate and fortunes of the whole nation and of his realms were centred not only in his office, but in his soul." He went on to say, "That was an ordeal which he could not have endured without the strong, loving support of his devoted and untiring wife and consort." Sir Winston Churchill was more than aware of anyone of the service the Queen Mother gave our nation. All of us owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the woman who played such a vital part in defending our liberty and democracy. We tend to think of great figures in our history, often as victorious generals, influential thinkers, or inspiring national leaders. The Queen Mother's great contribution to our nation was different and special. She did not lead successful military campaigns or inspire through speeches or transform the nation directly, but by standing resolute in the face of danger beside her husband the King and her country, and by providing a loving family in which her children and grandchildren could grow up, she made a contribution that was no less enduring. In this, the Queen Mother shared the attitude of millions of British soldiers, public servants, and private citizens, whose service to future generations is given through individual lives of courage, love, and devotion. When her country needed it most, she gave her inner strength and her wonderful personality. In doing so, she embodied what is good and noble about the people of our country. As the Prince of Wales said in his moving tribute to his grandmother, she understood the British character, and her heart belonged to this ancient land and its equally indomitable and humorous inhabitants. Queen Elizabeth's life embraced, as the Prime Minister has said, a century of tumultuous change. When she was born, the motor car was still an uncommon sight in our streets, and by the time she died, people think and thought nothing of flying to the other side of the world. It was a century of enormous technological advance, from communications to medicine, a century that produced penicillin and the internet, but also 2 world wars and the atomic bomb. It was a century in which democracy flourished, but it was also regularly threatened by regimes of monstrous depravity, such as those of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. And personally for her, during this century, she also had to suffer the early loss of a much-loved brother and the early loss of a husband, worn down perhaps by the responsibilities unexpected previously. From the Queen Mother we learn that character and inner strength can be a formidable anchor during times of change and upheaval. She felt no need to trim to the prevailing winds of fads and fashions. Instead, she stayed true to herself. Yet the Queen Mother never seemed anachronistic or less out of touch. Our memory of her has a timeless quality. The Queen Mother's strength was that she brought to her public duties the same enjoyment with which she practiced her private enthusiasms. She rejoiced in the company of young people. She was devoted to her regiments, passionate about her sporting interests, from fishing to racing, and brought energy to all the causes with which she was associated. I first heard of the death of the Queen Mother when I was fishing on a Scottish loch on Saturday. It struck me at the time she might well have approved of such a way to spend a Saturday afternoon. But my first reaction was sadness. But as I thought about it more on reflection, it turned to gratitude. For the Queen Mother's life was long, well-lived, and for the benefit of many. She was, frankly, the best of us. Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family should know that all of us in this house and in this country share their sadness, but that our sadness is balanced with pride. We are proud to have shared in the life of this deeply loved and remarkable lady.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my honourable and right honourable friends, it is our privilege also to give our support to the humble address moved by the Prime Minister a few minutes ago. And Her Majesty's passing, without doubt, does mark the end of a very long and indeed a seminal chapter in our country's history. Hers, without doubt, was indeed the story of the 20th century, and what an extraordinary story it has been. As the leader of the Conservative Party has just rightly acknowledged, her passing, of course, follows on only a very few short weeks after the untimely passing of Princess Margaret. For the Queen, of course, the whole House will wish to express its profound sympathy to lose both your only sister and now your mother in such a short space of time. But also, perhaps, let us not forget either Princess Margaret's children, who over the same period have lost both their mother and their grandmother. And coming as all this does in Jubilee year, it must be very, very hard indeed for that family, and having to live out such setbacks in such a public way. The Queen Mother, Mr. Speaker, came from an era which, for all of us today, seems so very distant. And yet, for all of us who had the opportunity on occasions to meet and to talk with her, it was so obvious that she belonged very much here today in the present. She had a fantastic knowledge and interest in contemporary events and people. She had the gift of being absorbed completely in whatever it was she was doing at any given time. And her achievements went beyond mere incredible statistical longevity. She was really the key bond between the monarchy and the people of our country. I remember my parents over the course of the weekend reflecting about their wartime experiences. One in Glasgow, your home city, Mr. Speaker, the other my father in the West Highlands of Scotland. And although the signal that the King and Queen sent, particularly to the people of London, but to the other cities in the south that suffered so much during the Blitz, the signal that they sent in terms of their personal commitment was vast. But even in remote places that would never catch a glimpse of the monarchy at that stage in the country's development, that message was one that resonated with people far away in the north of Scotland every bit as much as in the east end of London itself. It was psychologically very important. And I do want to say a special word about the special place that the Queen Mother always had in the hearts of people in Scotland itself. She was raised at Glamis Castle. Scotland was where she really belonged, whether it was the bracing air of Balmoral, whether it was salmon fishing on the River Dee or the River Thurso, or indeed her most immediate legacy, which has been discussed in the constituency, and I know that he hopes to catch your eye later as a trustee of the Castle of May, my honourable friend, the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, the far-sighted renovation of that castle, and now the way in which she has bequeathed it for future generations. That is a cause of great pride and celebration in our area. Scots don't always give of their affection lightly. I think the Prime Minister might agree with that in other contexts from time to time. Not over-impressed as a people by grandeur, but all generations of Scots took the Queen Mother absolutely to their hearts because of her warmth and because she identified so strongly with us. We've all got our Queen Mother anecdotes. One of my favourites was a friend of mine, the late Mark Bonham Carter. She used to visit once a year to Mark's house for either a private lunch or a dinner, and he'd invite a cross-section of age groups and walks of life, friends of his. And I was asked along to this, and it was very pleasant, a couple of dozen of us, and the Queen Mother was holding forth on views from agriculture to Europe, even to proportional representation. She wasn't very sound on that one. She arrived... I don't think we want to divide the House on that issue today, Miss Speaker. And she arrived with her private detective, a little bit late, and her private detective was shown into an adjacent room, and we all sat down and ate and argued our way through a splendid lunch, and at the end of it, it was time for her to leave, and somebody went off to raise the private detective. Well, raise proved to be the operative word. Private detective was sound asleep in an armchair. This was her protection. He looked a bit embarrassed by this discovery, and I said a word of condolence to him for having been caught out in this way, and he said, well, the problem is, he said, I'm exhausted, I just can't keep up with her. On the 100th birthday, her 100th birthday, a number of us had to present the loyal petitions on behalf of both Houses of Parliament at Clarence House, and she held court in every sense of the word in the garden. A beautiful afternoon it was too. Well, I got a real ear bashing about the state of fishing in the north of Scotland, and what was I going to do about it? This to me seemed to be rather a tall order, to say the least. What I would finally say, Mr. Speaker, is that this matriarch for the country as a whole, one that will be so greatly missed, perhaps teaches all of us a very important truth. We get obsessed with institutions and with structures, but people really respond to people. She responded to people. She liked people. And as a result, they liked her. And she helped save and preserve a great institution. We wish her well.
Yeah. Tamdale, on the 14th of February, 1990, Mr. Speaker, Jack Wetherall, had the happy idea of inviting a cross-section of 15 members of Parliament to meet the Queen Mother in Speaker's house. And the honourable gentleman from North Antrim, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, and indeed smiling down on the front bench, my right honourable friend, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, will remember the occasion. And after a very nice dinner and a beautiful speech from the Queen Mother, we were sat down one by the Speaker for 3 or 4 minutes next to her, that Speaker's couch that you know so well. And when it came to my turn, I just sat down, and she turned to me and said, Mr. Deal, tell me about Scotland and Scottish devolution. Now, how long have you got? I will spare the House what I said. But then she added, with a twinkle in her eye, and a rather, well, slightly malicious smile, she said, of course, you know that I can't tell you what I think. She had a sense of humour, and it was a very sharp sense of humour and it was a real sense of humour. But as the leader of the Liberal Party said, she was profoundly concerned about Scotland. And I had the good fortune as a member of the Council of the Scottish National Trust in the 1960s and 70s to have something to do with her, because the Scottish National Trust never had a more active patron. In fact, no organisation really had a more active patron than the Queen Mother. And it is the view of the late director, Sir James Stormers Darling, and confirmed by the Deputy Director, Finlay Macquarie, that it was the Queen Mother who drove through a number of schemes with her personal interest. The little houses at Dunkeld, the little houses at Curras, the good work of the Crown Estates Commissioners in Fife, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer knows very well, at Dysart. And really, it was her personal interest that made all the difference. And the officials of the Trust said not only is she patron, but she actually reads the minutes and asks us sharp questions about the minutes. So I suspect that for a number of organizations, she was far more than a titular head. And the honourable gentleman, the leader of the Liberal Party, referred to the Castle of May. And really the Castle of May ought to be her memorial, because it was personal to her. And I had the opportunity with the Historic Buildings Council in Scotland to go to the Castle of May. And at the end, I said to the experts taking us round, who had the good taste to advise her on this beautiful interior? Because she'd rescued a castle that was really irredeemable. And the people taking us round said, look, it wasn't anybody who advised her. She oversaw and did a lot of this herself. And therefore, can I express to one of the trustees who is with us, the honourable gentleman, the member for Caithness, in, I think, 4 trustees, chaired by Ash Wyndham, with John Stobo and Lord Caithness, all good wishes in their opening for the summer the Queen Mother's Castle, because this is very different from the royal palaces. It's hers, her taste. And on the matter of taste, I end, and I realise that I'm on rather delicate ground. But I say this, having known her, not well, but sufficiently, I just wonder if the sister of Fergus Bowes-Larn, who died tragically, as the leader of the opposition said, in the First World War, would really object if after we have paid tribute, and after a quarter of an hour or so, there was a discussion on the urgent situations, because I think that she would have been deeply concerned about events, for instance, in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
Alex Salmon.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru, want to express our condolences to friends and family of the Queen Mother and offer our support for the humble address. Mr Speaker, when a grand old lady dies in her 102nd year, it's certainly not a tragedy. Sadness certainly, but more a time for reflection on a remarkable life. I thought it was highly appropriate yesterday that the Queen Mother's coffin was accompanied by Pipe Major Motherwell playing the Dark Island, a lament, as you'll know from your own experience, Mr Speaker, written not in the mists of antiquity, but rather more than halfway through the Queen Mother's remarkable century. The speakers so far have referred to the momentous events which the Queen Mother has lived through. I think I would prefer just to offer a few recollections and reflections on that life. It has been said, and I like the Prime Minister's story about the Queen Mother's encounter with the disgruntled Afrikaner. Very much like that story. It's been said that the Queen Mother bore her Scottish identity with pride, and that's certainly true. What I find remarkable is that each of the 4 speakers thus far, on their personal experience with the Queen Mother, emerged totally convinced that she was on their side. I think that indicates a remarkable political talent, not to say a certain toleration on the Queen Mother's part. But the Queen Mother did bear her Scottish identity with pride. And looking back, as I've done over the last few days, on the front pages of the papers on the accession, it was a very early relationship, love relationship, between the Queen Mother and the Scottish people, because she was greeted then as the first Scottish Queen for 400 years. And it probably was the Queen Mother's Scottish upbringing at Glamis which gave her her greatest talent and gift of all, which stood her in greatest stead. Not so much a common touch, I think, as an ease and facility with people. In public life, I suspect there is no greater challenge for anyone in public life than dealing with people in a state of bereavement. To find that mix of compassion and humour sometimes, which allows people to feel that bit better in their times of greatest extremity. 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker, I witnessed how that should be done when the Queen Mother unveiled the Piper Alpha Memorial in Hazelhead Park in Aberdeen. It was an extraordinarily hot day, near 90 degrees. The Queen Mother herself was 90, and yet for a matter of hours that afternoon, she behaved towards 167 bereaved families in an absolutely impeccable fashion, an example for all in public life, much aspired to, but not always followed. And I know that in the recollections others have of encountering similar situations, then that is the experience which has been shared by us all. I shared with the Queen Mother an interest in horse racing. Indeed, we shared it with the Leader of the House as well, although I suspect neither the Leader of the House or myself conferred the same respectability on that sport as the Queen Mother did. And over the last few days, it has been written and reminisced about the mysterious collapse of the Queen Mother's horse, Devon Loch, which belly flopped about 50 yards from winning the Grand National in 1956. But the remarkable thing about the story is not the event, unprecedented and remarkable though that was. The remarkable thing about the story is the Queen Mother's reaction to that defeat. Firstly, a philosophical that's racing. Secondly, a concern for the jockey, the horse and the trainer. And thirdly, and most importantly, a public and fulsome congratulations for the owners and connections of the winning horse. There was something irresistible in the way that the Queen Mother reacted to adversity over large events and small ones. And therefore I think it's highly appropriate, as indeed the Racing Post did yesterday, as the Queen Mother goes on her final journey next Tuesday, to wish her a sunny day and going good.
David Trimble.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the humble address in its expression of condolence to Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family on the death of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. There have been reflections, and in doing so, in expressing that sympathy on behalf of my colleagues, I think I should also say that I'm conscious of the fact that I'm also expressing sympathy on behalf of very many people in Northern Ireland, drawn from right across the political spectrum, who will also feel a sense of loss and a sense of sadness at the death of the Queen Mother. A number of people have spoken about the Queen Mother's character and her sense of humour and the way in which she could conduct herself so as to put almost anyone she was speaking to at ease. She did indeed express or carry herself with extraordinary grace, without in any way losing any sense of her majesty and her position. She had the same effect on the people of Northern Ireland too, from the very first time that she visited Northern Ireland in 1924 as the Duchess of York, right through until visits comparatively recently. But of course, one remembers her not so much, or not only because of her character and her longevity, and not so much either because of the events that she lived through, but more because of the contribution that she made towards this nation over that period of time. Reference has been made to her courage and her sense of duty, and inevitably one thinks of how she and His Majesty the King, King George VI, conducted themselves during the Second World War. But I rather suspect that when the full story is told, we will realise that she made an even greater contribution in the mid to late 30s with her husband, providing a degree of stability at a time when our society was under very great stress. And I think that act of contribution at that time, and of course during the war years, will be seen as being not the only contribution to our nation's life, but its most significant one. Her courage didn't diminish either. Indeed, it's remembered on a visit to Northern Ireland in 1983 that the plans and details for that visit had been stolen from a press cameraman's car, I think it was, in Dublin a few days beforehand. But she carried on with the visit and indeed at points departed from the itinerary in order to mingle with the crowd, of course to the consternation of those that were there to provide for her security. But it did emphasise her courage and her ready rapport with people. She made, as we've all acknowledged, a tremendous contribution over a very long period of time. But underneath it all was that sense of duty and that sense of having a job to discharge and a service to give to our nation, and that will be remembered.
Stuart Bell. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to say a few words as Second Church Estates Commissioner on behalf of the Church of England as the established church, but I would also wish to say that my remarks will cover all faiths and all religions. May I say, Mr. Speaker, that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, lived the life of a true Christian, finding her deep spirituality in the worship of God, in the stories of the Bible, in the singing of hymns. She enjoyed going to church. It was a part of her life. As the Archbishop of Canterbury has said, Christian love shone through her character. It was the great depth and simplicity of her own Christian faith that saw her through 101 years. Her faith would see her through the troubled days of the abdication of Edward VIII, which saw her husband come to the throne, the dark days of the Blitz and the years of the war, the anxieties of state, the tragedy of losing her husband when only half of her life had been lived, numerous operations and health scares that have tended to be forgotten since she lived to see out the fullness of her days. Her faith and her family and her sense of public duty, she was steadfast in them all. They were a joy and a comfort to her. We saw goodness and love in her life, and what that love and goodness has meant to each one of us. She might have been born in a world of privilege, but she subordinated that privilege to a sense of public duty. Her motto seemed to be, the greater the privilege, the greater the public duty. She had a vision, a clear view of her world. She might have walked with kings and archbishops, but she never lost Kipling's common touch. In her love of racing, she would have seen the likes of the famous tipster Prince Monolulu in the racecourse. She might have read and enjoyed the racing novels of Sir Dick Francis, the ex-jockey, but she also introduced the royal walkabout with the king. Faith, it is said, Mr. Speaker, can move mountains. The Queen Mother did not need to move mountains, but she was able to show that faith can be an inspiration to us all, to lead a good life, a useful life, a dedicated life, that goodness, like mercy, can touch the lives of others, as in the Blitz walking around the East End. That even the memory, the recollection, the remembrance of things past can create goodness in others and make better persons of thousands and possibly millions who had never met her, never spoken to her, but who had felt her presence and been motivated by her example. The Queen Mother has left us not a footprint in the sands of time, but a monument to decency, a beacon that shall shine as a guiding light unto a perfect day. The Church shall rejoice in her life, because her faith has nourished the faith of others. Christians and others of all religions the world over can be inspired by her example in what for many of them in different parts of the world are troubled times. She believed in the faith that, like love, passeth all understanding. We must mourn her passing, but think of her in our prayers, and think too of those she has left behind, not only members of the royal family who clearly loved her dearly, but the people of our nation who equally loved her.
Amin Paisley. Speaker, sir, could I identify myself with the remarks that have been made by others and the sympathy of the people I represent in this House and the people of Northern Ireland that I represent here on this sad occasion. Our words, Mr. Speaker, are but breath. They're like life itself. They appear for a little time and then vanish away. Our tributes here today are really but tiny tributaries which can never fill the great ocean of what we would like to express at a time of national sorrow and at the end of a very important historic era in this nation's history. I remember listening to King George VI speaking on the radio, and he put a stamp of mortality upon some words written by Miss Harkins. The words were these. He said, "I said to the man that stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I might enter into the unknown, and that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go into the darkness and put your hand in the hand of God. That shall be better to you than light and safer than a known way. So I went forth, and finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night, and he led me towards the hills and the breaking of the day." I think the faith of the Queen Mother could be summed up in those words. She herself had evidently done what was said by her husband on that occasion. We might well pose a question to ourselves in this House today. What was the secret of her love? What was the secret of her courage? What was the secret of her steadfastness? What was the secret of her loyalty? What was the secret of her determination, her sparkle, and her zest for living throughout her whole life? No doubt vast numbers of people who listened to the tributes paid on a very good programme by the BBC on Sunday evening will be struck by two very important incidents. One in the days of sunrise for her, and one in the days of sunset for her. The one of sunrise was the recall of the fact that at her church confirmation, she picked for her hymn, a very well-known hymn, "I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, or to defend his cause, maintain the honour of his word, and glory in his cross." Sunrise. And then there was another incident referred to when sunset was coming. Two trees in her castle grounds had to be felled, and they worried what her reaction would be. But when she came out and looked on the felled trees, she said, "I'm glad now they're gone, for we now can see the mountains." And then she repeated that magnificent psalm of David, and she said, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my strength. My strength cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth." And she continued repeating that to the final verse, "The Lord shall preserve thy going out and coming in from this time forth, even forevermore." As I sat here and the members gathered for this special meeting of this House, I asked myself the question, what would the Queen Mother say to us if she was here? And I thought she probably would quote those great lines by Browning, "Grow old along with me, the best has yet to be. The last of life for which the first was made. Our times are in his hand who said, a whole I planned. Youth shows but half. Trust God, see all, and be not afraid. If ever a lady saw it all, in a very long, long life, she saw it. And I believe that if we can learn the lessons of her life, that this nation can renew its strength. I salute the memory of a great queen and a great queen mother. I salute the memory of a job that was well done, of a race that was well run, and a battle that was well won. John Bunyan, the author of The Immortal Dream, said of the pilgrim, they laid the pilgrim in a large upper chamber facing the sun rising. The name of that chamber was peace. So we can say the same about the Queen Mother.
King.
I'm speaking in this debate to represent the people of the East End, who, as the whole country knows, held the Queen Mother in great affection. I wish to speak about not what the Queen Mother inherited or passed on, but what the Queen Mother merited. She merited respect, and nowhere is that respect greater than in my constituency. Land of the pearly kings and queens who were inspired by the sparkling monarch who picked her way through the rubble. As I drove to Parliament this morning, I passed the plaque at the bottom of my road which reads, "Here fell the first flying bomb on London." 60,000 British civilians died during the war, 30,000 of them in East London. Indeed, the first EDM I ever tabled was a memorial for civilians who died during that war. As the Prime Minister quoted her saying earlier of the East End carnage, the destruction is so awful and the people so wonderful, deserve a better world. The Queen Mother inspired the East End during the Blitz. One East Ender recalls, "There was still an air raid on when she walked through the rubble. I always thought the world of her. She doesn't sit back pompous-like. I remember her putting her arm around people covered in blood and grime and consoling them. I feel she knows what our lives are like." As my neighbour Mary Isaacs put it, she came down Bow Road slowly, and oh, what a lovely smile. As one other Cockney woman put it, "Ain't she lovely? Oh, ain't she just bloody lovely?" So the century she spanned has closed. She was the last empress. And although the world in which she was born and in which she moved has vanished, the characteristics with which she is associated endure, and we in the East End give thanks for them.
On the 1st of August 1979, Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty the Queen Mother was installed as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports in succession to Sir Robert Menzies. Since I have the honour to represent in this House the constituency which contains within it two of the original Cinque Ports, Hythe and Romney, I am grateful for the opportunity of saying a few words about the enormous contribution which the Queen Mother made in her capacity as Lord Warden to our part of the realm. The origin of the Confederation of the Cinque Ports goes back at least to the reign of King Edward the Confessor, and the office of Lord Warden is almost as ancient. The Lord Warden has many privileges, Mr. Speaker. As the letters patent record, the Lord Warden is entitled, among other things, to all manners of wrecks of the sea, jetsam, flotsam, and laden goods, merchandises, and effects whatsoever, which at any time or time should be cast away, wrecked, or lost. I have no knowledge of the extent, if any, to which the Queen Mother actually claimed the right to any of those privileges during her long term of office as Lord Warden. But she certainly took her duties most seriously. Those duties were many and various. They included the responsibility of ensuring that beached whales were given a proper burial, and that at least one tooth was extracted from each beached whale and sent to the Natural History Museum so that the whale could be properly identified. You understand, Mr. Speaker, that was not a duty which the Lord Warden was required personally to carry out. But I do know that the Queen Mother always took a very keen interest in the results of the researches of the Natural History Museum. She came every year to Warmer Castle, and she always took the opportunity of her visits to East Kent to visit schools, to perform all sorts of other responsibilities and duties, to open community halls, like the community hall in Lydd in my constituency, which she opened in her 94th year. And on every occasion, she lit up with her presence the whole of the gathering involved. As many of my constituents have said, she was just as much at home with children as she was with those of her own age. My abiding memory of her is when she officiated at the unveiling of the Battle of Britain Memorial. That took place on the tops of the cliffs at Capel, on the boundary of my constituency. It was a dreadful day. The rain came down in sheets. The wind was at least at hurricane force, or at least that's what most of us felt. We all huddled in the rather precarious protection of the tents which had been erected. But the Queen Mother, apparently oblivious to the weather, went from one tent to another, radiating charm, making sure that she met absolutely everyone who was there, and illuminating the greyest of days with the magic of her personality. She will be much missed, Mr. Speaker, throughout this realm, but especially in East Kent. She will always be remembered.
John Thursall.
Mr. Speaker, all those who have spoken this morning have said far more eloquently than I can of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's immense contribution to our national life and to the national stage. Her courage, her zest for life, her sense of duty and devotion, her courage, and above all, I would say, her gentle leadership, which she showed for nearly a century throughout our national life. And above all, I feel, as has come out today, she was an exemplary human being. What I would like to do is pay a tribute to her, a very parochial, very partisan tribute, on behalf of myself and my constituents. It's very hard to put into words the affection which she felt for Caithness and the affection which the people of Caithness felt for her. In part, it was her obvious commitment to duties in the constituency, which were pretty small when judged on the national scale, opening the Harbour Master's office in Scrabster or visiting Caithness Glass, but nonetheless greatly appreciated. In part, it was the evident joy which she took in attending local events, such as her annual visit to the Society of Caithness Artists, or attending each year the May Games, where I once witnessed her consoling a team of German motorcyclists who had just been beaten in the tug-of-war by the motley crew of footmen and equerries from the Castle of May. But I think, above all, Mr. Speaker, it was simply the fact that once a year she came among us. Once a year she was in Caithness, she was ours, and she was our very special royal. And it was a feeling on behalf of the people of Caithness that Her Majesty warmly reciprocated. And I think it was to do with the fact that the Castle of May was the only home that she ever owned herself. She first saw it in 1952, when it was on the point of falling down. Indeed, she once told me that in one room were the occupants and in the other room were the sheep. But she bought it, she took it over, and over a period of 3 or 4 years, she restored it. And she did do it all herself. Indeed, she had many happy visits to the Ship's Wheel in Thurso, the local antique shop, which no longer exists, with the late Hetty Munro, and bought a number of antiques. It may be just coincidence, but my own family home was demolished at roughly that time. And I do like to think that perhaps there was the odd piece in the Castle of May which I might recognise. But she enjoyed it enormously. And later on she added Longo Farm, where she became a tremendous connoisseur of stock. She understood Aberdeen Angus cattle. She understood North Country Cheviot sheep. And I know that both of the breed societies for those two breeds were immensely grateful for and encouraged by her patronage over the years. She was a keen stockman, and she read the Preston Journal agricultural pages, I am told, every day to keep abreast. And I think it was this practicality that she had, which was typical of her, that meant that in 1996 she put the castle into a trust, of which I have the honour to be one of the 4 trustees. She has left us with a marvellous legacy, but also a challenge. She wished the castle to be open and available to the public, and as soon as the current building works are complete, sometime in July, we will be opening the Castle of May to receive the public, as was her wish. But also it was her home, and she brought a warmth and friendliness to that house, which all those who ever went into it will never forget. And the other part of our challenge is her vision of keeping that house in good order and keeping that feeling of warmth and friendliness in the house. Queen Elizabeth brought a special warmth and light to everyone she ever met. It was her great gift. We in Caithness will particularly miss her. I will miss her. She touched all of our lives. But above all today, we thank God for her life, for her tremendous service to her country, to her great sense of humour, and whatever journey she is on, we wish her well.
Ian Luke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make this humble contribution to this humble address on behalf of the citizens of Dundee and my constituents. The Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, was a freeman of the city of Dundee on 2 counts. One, in that she was as the Queen and Empress of India, but secondly as the Colonel-in-Chief of the Black Watch, which is the home regiment of Dundee, Tayside, Angus and Fife. Indeed, the Castle of Glamis lies across the Sidlaws in the beautiful Vale of Strathmore, and indeed the valley and the whole area was connected by this affiliation and association with a regiment which played its part in all of Britain's campaigns, and especially during the First World War, where she lost family there, and during the time when her own family were closely associated. She was the Colonel-in-Chief of that regiment, and she was well received in Dundee during her many visits in that guise. I'd also like to pay tribute to her time as Chancellor of the University of Dundee. As a graduate of the City of Dundee's University, I was proud and very, very aware of her prime role during the 3 decades she was the Chancellor of that university, in the way she handled events at the university, the way she presided over the graduation and the subsequent garden parties, which I had the opportunity to visit and to meet with her during that time. During her long association with Dundee, she played a vital part in an organisation probably not well known in this chamber called the Lord Roberts Workshop, a workshop which was created after the First World War to give disabled people and disabled servicemen employment in building furniture and having a useful life after the actual sufferings of the First World War. She kept up that connection during all her life over a span of 5 decades, and actually was involved in the actual transfer of the organisation, which combined with a blind institute to create a very new organisation called Dovetail Limited in the 1990s. And she was there at that time also. One of the major events that she was involved in the changing life of the city was during the opening of the Tay Bridge in 1965, where she played the presiding role of its bridge, which created an immense difference to the centre of the city of Dundee. It was during that time, or as a consequence of that, I was able to meet with her again very briefly during the time when I was the chairman of the restoration of a bandstand in Madeline Green, and that's perhaps the mark of the woman. She crossed the Tay rail bridge on a frequent occasion. On a letter from a restoration committee asking her to make a donation or be involved in the restoration of this Victorian bandstand, we got a personally written letter back from her indicating that she'd seen the bandstand on many occasions crossing the bridge, and she was very much aware of its poor state and be happy to contribute and be involved in the restoration. And one of our ladies in waiting presented us a small gift to put into a raffle, along with pictures from people like Macintosh Patrick, one of our favourite artists, to help us raise the £100,000 to actually restore the bandstand back to its Victorian grandeur. And as a sign of respect, we invited her down during one of our visits to the Lord Robert workshop to preside over the opening event in 1991. It was a very wet day, so what we had to do was, given she was not as young as she had been, we brought it indoors and created an event with a small band, with flowers and children around the actual rededication of the bandstand. And at the end, as she was being moved away by a personal detective and a ladies in waiting, she insisted that she spent time with the actual children who made up the band, to a little word of thanks for their efforts on behalf of the restoration. And that, Mr. Speaker, I think speaks of the way she looked at things, and in the actual detail she'll tackle things, and her personal touch. It's no mistake that she was called the Rose of Glams. Although she came from a rural area, her actual smiling face was able to obviously conquer the hearts of the rough diamonds of the East End, and also to tame the rough spirits in Dundee. It's only right, I'm glad to have this opportunity to pay my respects. I know the Lord Provost, the City of Dundee has been invited and will be here at the funeral next week, but to pay my respects on behalf of the citizens of Dundee to one of the longest serving freemen on 2 counts. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Patrick Cormac.
Mr. Speaker, it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. I also have a very fond memory of 1991. I went to Clarence House as chairman of the William Morris Craft Fellowship, along with a brilliant young woodcarver and some members of the committee. And our task was to present Her Majesty with a wonderful carved head of William Morris. And she received this with great delight. She looked at it, she stroked the wood, she said, "What a noble head. Reminds me of one of your colleagues in the House," she said, "Mr. Folds." And the resemblance was indeed striking, Mr. Speaker. And that was just one of a number of memories that I have, but my fondest are of receiving her when I was Warden of St. Margaret's across the road, the House of Commons Church. And every year she came to the Field of Remembrance in November for the dedication of that field. And every year she would go around after the short service and she would speak to as many as she could of the assembled veterans and the bereaved, taking, as it were, a personal interest in each one. And then when the tour was complete, she would come into St. Margaret's and she would sign the book. And she had a great love for our church, and she contributed to its restoration when we had the great appeal some years ago. And I remember in I think it was 1991, she was turned 90, and she came in and she said, "I'm terribly sorry because I think I've been too long this year." She'd been about an hour and 3/4 going round. She said, "You know, there are an awful lot of old people out there." And that, Mr. Speaker, was indeed typical of her. The Prime Minister spoke very movingly of all she did and all she meant during the Second World War. And it does seem to me that it would be very appropriate that we should try and commemorate the Queen Mother in a very tangible and proper way, and all that she did, all she stood for. And the fact there's nobody in this chamber for whom she wasn't a central figure in the nation's life throughout our lives. And I wonder if we ought not to take the Monday nearest the 11th of November and make that an annual holiday, remembering the veterans and the fallen, and remembering also her. And I hope that that's an idea that will commend itself to the Prime Minister and colleagues in all parts of the House. And I hope too, Mr. Speaker, that there will be some further thought to giving next Tuesday as a public holiday. This House is not going to sit as a mark of respect, and that is right and proper. Others should have a similar opportunity. Mr. Speaker, we are commemorating the life of the most remarkable woman of the 20th century, who has touched all our lives, directly or indirectly, who will never be forgotten, but her memory should not be forgotten either.
Michael Foster. Speaker, on behalf of my constituents in Hastings and Rye, I'd like to express our heartfelt condolences to Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family at this time of personal loss. Families, whether royal or not, suffer the same sense of bereavement, and for those in the public eye, the hurt is no less. Indeed, during last year's general election, my own dear mother, Dolly Foster, died, and I do appreciate, therefore, how much more difficult it is for those who must grieve in the public gaze. But I want to refer in my brief contribution to the enormous affection and respect in which the Queen Mother was held by so many of my constituents. Many, because of the age profile of Hastings and Rye, personally recall her sense of duty and commitment during the war years, of which many other honourable members have spoken. I recall the wonderful celebrations we had in our town centre on the occasion of her 100th birthday. It was Tesco's champagne and 1066 birthday cake, but I'm pretty sure that she would certainly have welcomed the knees up that all our elderly folk enjoyed. But the special affection in which Her Majesty was held by so many of my constituents arose in part because of two special relationships. The first may seem trivial, but the fact is she was an honorary member of Hastings Old Town Winkle Club, who had presented her with a special gold Winkle brooch, and which she wore on her 100th birthday to the pride and satisfaction of all we Hastingsers. I'm a Winkler too, she was heard to say as the Winkle Club contingent passed in the parade. But the more significant connection was in her role as Lord Warden of the Cinque, which the Right Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hythe has already referred. I hope he won't mind me saying, but Hastings is the senior Cinque, and Rye and Winchelsea as well are all members of the Confederation. So when the mayors of my constituency in Hastings and Rye, as barons of the Cinque Ports, attend the funeral next Tuesday of our beloved Lord Warden, it will be a further link with the Crown, which goes back, it is believed, for more than 1,000 years to Edward the Confessor. Whilst older generations will remember Her Majesty setting out at 8 a.m. each morning to visit the communities bombed the night before, Her Majesty on that basis was a worthy holder of the office of Lord Warden, a position which Winston Churchill assumed in the 1940s. The Cinque Ports were historically the front line in the defence of the realm, and for Her Majesty to be our Lord Warden was for us a great honour. But our links in Hastings and Rye and the whole of the Confederation go back much further than that. It's now 65 years since the barons of the Cinque Ports, our town mayors, attended her coronation. The ritual of carrying a canopy over the king's head at the coronation was abandoned in the 19th century, and the privilege granted to the barons of the Cinque Ports to carry it was lost. But Edward VII directed that the barons should always be invited to such celebrations, and I fear such events as next Tuesday. Thus it was our links with Her Majesty starting early. It was entirely appropriate, nonetheless, that her inspiration in the war was why she was appointed Lord Warden. Many of her friends have said that within her sense of fun there was a ring of steel, so it was with her association with us. Within her enjoyment of our annual Cinque Ports picnic, there was a sterner association. We have always been the front line in a purpose to which she gave vital years of her life, the defence of our realm. So the next duties of the barons will be a sad one, but in attending the funeral service next Tuesday, they will do so representing the affections of the people of the Cinque Ports towns, but also their pride in the association they had with this woman of duty.
It was Solmes.
Speaker, sir, I wanted to intervene only briefly today as the House this day records its tributes to Queen Elizabeth, because to my eternal good fortune I had the great privilege and joy to have known Her Majesty for a little over 40 years. I want to testify to the oneness of Her Majesty's character. Whoever you were, whatever your age, whatever you did, or wherever you came from, the Queen Mother was always the same to everyone. Her completely natural personality and her sparkling wit and charm truly put all who met her at their ease. As the Prince of Wales said in his most moving tribute to his grandmother 2 nights ago, she was indeed indomitable, tireless, wise and loving, with a unique natural grace and understanding of the British character. She had as well an infectious optimism, just as well given her love of national hunt racing. And she was one of those rare people able to span the generations. And what a life it was. Born in the reign of Queen Victoria, married to the last King Emperor, the first non-royal Queen Consort since Catherine Parr in the 16th century. She lived in 2 centuries and through 2 fearful wars, in the first of which she lost her brother Fergus Bowes-Lyon, an officer of the Black Watch, at the Battle of Lewes in 1915, an event which marked her for the rest of her life. But it was the telescope of history which gave her such perception, wisdom and experience. She lived in the reigns of 6 monarchs through a period of the most profound social, technological and economic change. And yet she never lost her bearings, fortified and sustained as she was by the discipline of her Christian faith and by her strong principles. She wrote in a foreword to a book, an anthology of assurance, by one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Elizabeth Bassett, that we can, at one and the same time, be truly contemporary men and women, and yet have our thoughts and lives rooted in truths that do not change. That was the Queen Mother. Mr. Speaker, her affection, admiration and respect for the armed forces and her robust defence of all military traditions bound her closely to all 3 services, and of course particularly to their old comrades. Indeed, she caused me some testing moments when I was Minister of State for the Armed Forces, as she kindly but very firmly let me know in no uncertain manner of her concern, or perhaps indeed her disapproval, at some cut or amalgamation proposed by the wicked government. Her loyalty and support for all her regiments and her naval and air force affiliations was and will ever remain of the most profound importance and encouragement to all who deeply value and cherish such an historic connection of which they will forever be extremely proud. Queen Elizabeth loved life, but she was also a symbol for all the generations of courage and endurance in peace and war, of truth and gentleness and constancy to duty. In Kipling's words, she did indeed walk with kings and yet retain the common touch. With her passing, someone very special and very splendid and wholly unique has gone out of all our lives forever. Truly, it can be said of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, that we shall never see her like again. Rest eternal grant her, and may light perpetual shine upon her.
Yeah. Simon Hughes. Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to follow the personal tribute given by the Honourable Gentleman Member for Miss Sussex. I just want to add a complimentary word to the Honourable Lady, the Member for Bethnal Green and Bow. When I had the privilege to be elected nearly 20 years ago, I was already aware that one of the most life-affecting experiences of the Docklands communities in London had been the war and the Blitz. And the person or the two people who most personified the resilience of the Docklands communities, who in many families paid the ultimate price, were the King and the Queen. It wasn't as if there was very much in common in their background. It wasn't as if the electors would naturally vote Conservative in those communities. Indeed, the very eminent MP for Bermondsey was a Republican and was elected again and again and again in the 20s and the 30s until the Second World War. But when the Queen and the King came within days of the start of World War II to inspect the civil defence forces in Bermondsey, when they came again the following year to support and encourage the WRVS, when the Queen came again the following year to go down to the air raid shelters, she, on each occasion, encouraged and inspired and drew the respect of everybody. And whether people were monarchists or Republicans, they thought she was a star. And I think whatever political views people have, everybody is now generous enough to say that. And after the war, she kept up that amazing level of service. She hadn't chosen to be born an aristocrat. She hadn't chosen to become the Queen. She hadn't chosen to be widowed so early in life. But she chose to make of each of those opportunities a life of service. And for 50 years from her widowhood, she continued that life of service. Only a few years ago, she came on her last visit to the Docklands to see it rebuilt after the war. She visited the new housing. She opened a housing estate in the Surrey Docks. And then she asked to go into the pub. And I think she was the first queen, the first monarch, who had ever, as it were, asked to go where normal people go on a pretty regular basis. And she went into the pub and she had her half pint of beer and she chatted to the people. And they said then she was a star. And they said then what a power of good she had done for that community over the years. And so I just want to say on behalf of those communities from all over the world who've come to settle in the Docklands, many of whom fought on the home front and many of whom went and fought abroad, they are very grateful for her life of service. She did a power of good to her family. She did a power of good to her faith. She did a power of good to the monarchy. She did a power of good to her people. And she did a power of good to this country at home and overseas. And we are very grateful and give thanks for her very much.
Henry Billiam. Mr. Speaker, the first time the Queen Mother visited her constituency was in January 1923, shortly after she was engaged to the Duke of York. The last time she left my constituency was by helicopter in February this year on her way to the funeral of her daughter, Princess Margaret. In between, there were 79 years of countless visits and deep involvement in the local community. As my honourable friend, the member for South West Norfolk, knows only too well, she was very proud to become the first female to receive the freedom of the borough of Lynn in 1954. She said at the time, "I can assure you that nothing pleases me so much as the knowledge that you think of me as a neighbour." When the King first brought me to Norfolk, I fell in love with the place and its people, and this love has only grown over years. This is a very big part of my heart here in Norfolk. Quite something from a Scots lass, that. This love manifests itself, Mr. Speaker, through patronage of numerous organisations. The King's Lynn Festival and the Sandringham Flower Show featured very much as a focus to her annual summer visits. And when she came over Christmas and over New Year, she was involved with the local women's institutes and indeed with local schools. She even instituted her own personal awards to pupils at local secondary schools for academic excellence, and she invited them every year to Sandringham to talk about their careers and their ambitions for the future. All of this, Mr. Speaker, was interspersed with many other official visits. And whenever there was a natural disaster locally, like the floods in 1953, she was on hand to give comfort to people. Her knowledge of West Norfolk and its people was awesome. And I discovered this shortly after being elected. The King's Lynn Customs House was threatened with closure. Kingsland's great historic building. And it had a very uncertain future. I was summoned, well, in fact, hardly summoned. I was contacted by her private secretary who said, if you can get away from the whips, Her Majesty would be delighted if you would come and join her for dinner. Well, the whips wouldn't believe that, for a start. And I couldn't believe it either, because she made it look as though I was doing her a favour, going along to talk about Kingsland's Custom House. And she told me to rattle some cages. What a great turn of phrase that was. And she told me to use my position as MP to just try and quietly get a few things done. So I received advice very early on as an MP from a very wise person. And the Kingsland Customs House was saved. And she then, Mr. Speaker, wrote a letter to the local paper to thank everyone locally for being involved in this campaign. Shortly afterwards, she was taking a great interest in the local railway line, because she was always very concerned about the railway line, having used it many times in the past. And she wanted to be kept informed about the campaign to electrify the railway line. And she then let it be known that she would like to come to the opening of the Kingsland electrification. And I thought, well, hang on, something's gone wrong here. Kings don't come to openings. They don't turn up in a taxi and watch some junior minister unveil a plaque. They actually do the opening. But that was her modesty. And can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, any minister wanting to come to an opening? They want to do the opening themselves. And she came to that opening, and having met 5 or 6 different grades of British Rail management, she obviously was charming to them, but I could tell that she wanted to get on and meet real people. And she then went to meet the drivers and the conductors and the local station staff, and spent a long time talking to them, and really made their day. Probably gave them the best day of their careers. She was indeed a life enhancer, and had the ability to make people who she met feel quite fantastic. And, Mr. Speaker, her hospitality and generosity was limitless. She never said no to a request for a prize or a present for a raffle for the local charity in West Norfolk. This kindness touched the lives of thousands of people. I have a personal debt of gratitude to her, as on a number of occasions she invited my wife and I to stay with her. But, Mr. Speaker, as long as she lived, a bright light shone upon my constituency. It was a light based on the best human qualities, those encapsulated by her: compassion, sympathy, and concern for others. Now that light has been extinguished, my constituency will be the poorer for it. But I will go to the service on Tuesday to represent my constituency and to give thanks for a remarkable life.
Michael Glenn. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for 70 years the Queen Mother made a family home at Windsor. Affection, gratitude and respect for her life of service is felt keenly in and around our town. So now is sorrow and loss at her death at Royal Lodge. This was clear when I took my 2 youngest children up to the castle gates on Saturday evening. Already people from the town and visitors from all over the country and from around the world were gathering. They were drawn together to share their sense of shock. It was quiet and dignified. However much one may anticipate death, it always comes as a great blow. And Windsor was no more prepared for this than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. The people outside the castle, scene of so many memories in the life of the Queen Mother and where she will be laid to rest, were in their private ways trying to come to terms with their sadness. Over the Easter weekend, the crowds grew. Windsor is accustomed to large numbers of visitors on bank holiday weekends, but those gathering at the castle were not drawn by mere curiosity. I was hugely impressed by how my 11-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter reacted. They and the other young people shared the same emotions as the older generations. I was very struck by what the Prime Minister and my right honourable friend had to say about the sheer span of the Queen Mother's life. She was a hugely familiar figure to us all. She had become a symbol of continuity in our society, and continuity brings with it a sense of security, something we all need in our lives, older and younger people alike. In Windsor, we are very aware of the royal family. I think we try hard to live together in a neighbourly way, letting them get on with their lives as human beings. But the deep affection local people hold for the royal family should be no surprise, and that feeling is warmly reciprocated. Over many years, the Queen Mother undertook countless visits and appearances in the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. Many of our shops now have photographs in their windows, and in the past few days I have come across dozens of local people who have particular memories of her. Many speak of a sense of personal loss. And I'd also like to tell the House of the special place the Queen Mother holds in the hearts of those who live within the Great Park, especially in the village with its York Club. Many honourable members will know Cumberland Lodge, whose foundation and development owed so much to her vision and commitment, and she would frequently greet its guests from all parts of the country and the Commonwealth at Sunday services at the Chapel of All Saints, the chapel where she lay after her death. The Queen Mother made a home for her family at Royal Lodge. We will all have read or heard accounts of the happy and formal atmosphere of that house, but most people know the Queen Mother best from the times when she was out in the world, on parade as it were. She knew that people would turn out dressed in their finest and be on their best behaviour to meet her, and she always did the same. On state occasions and Garter Day she showed star qualities. At Royal Ascot and down at the Windsor racecourse, she clearly joined in the fun. And with the many voluntary groups and public organisations in Windsor, she showed a lively interest and real concern. So the Royal Borough, although in mourning, is also giving grateful thanks for the interest and affection that Queen Elizabeth had for us. Tributes more eloquent than mine will be paid to the Queen Mother, Mr. Speaker, but today, with humility, I speak for my constituents in expressing our love, our respect and our deep sympathy to the Queen and her family.
Sir Robert Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to support the humble address, given the strong contacts between my constituency and Her Majesty the Queen Mother and her long association there since her honeymoon with as a Duchess of York in Burke Hall, part of the royal estate of Balmoral. The association obviously spans much of her life and much of her summers. When she wasn't in the Castle of May, she would move south to Burke Hall and join with the rest of the royal family in Deeside. And I think very much in the northeast of Scotland, we almost take for granted that they're part of the fabric of our society, and therefore they have an unintrusive time in Balmoral. It's much of a chance to get away from the glare of publicity and enjoy a true family life. And the Queen Mother in particular will be much missed. It's very much been welcome today's news that the royal warrants that associate many of the shops and businesses with her patronage over the years will be able to keep those warrants up for the next 5 years to keep that connection that she had in the community. Her last public service in Scotland was to another part of my constituency in Arford, which has a long association with the Aberdeen Angus Cattle Society. And as has already been mentioned, she was a keen breeder of Aberdeen Angus cattle. And she joined with her grandson at the unveiling of a statue to mark that connection. And it was a time, obviously, when the rural community was under much stress with the foot and mouth. And she spent over 40 minutes on her feet, mingling with several hundred people, bringing some of a joyous occasion and bringing some light into what was a very dark year in the farming and rural community. She then, a few days later, her last public appearance was in Scotland was at Crathy Opportunity holiday site, which is just opposite Balmoral, where they're building homes for people with mobility difficulties. And she did quip that she hoped to come back this year and actually enjoy one of the homes. Clearly not in person, but I'm sure in spirit. And I think in many ways the most lasting tribute we can give to Her Majesty, and what many have said already about her great contribution to the century, and a way we can keep alive, is the fact that she symbolised so much for us as individuals, as well as in considering our public policy, that you're never too old to make a public contribution. And if we can remember that no matter what age someone has, they are an individual who has something still to contribute. And if individuals can remember whatever their age they are, they have something to contribute, then she will have left a lasting legacy for all of us.
Ian Taylor.
Mr. Speaker, in supporting the humble address, one shares the sense of solemnity which has befallen on the House. But actually, if one listens to all the tributes, the vitality of Her Majesty the Queen Mother comes through. The twinkle in her eye has come through in all the anecdotes to which we've been listening. My own experience with the Queen Mother came in two different aspects of my life. First, as a governor for a while of Research into Ageing, a charity which tried to extend the quality of active life. I did on one occasion remark that if we could bottle up
the elixir of life represented by Queen Elizabeth, we would have solved some of our research problems. I never did have the courage, Mr. Speaker, to ask her what might have been in the bottle that she carried with her. But nevertheless, it was a remarkable way that she served the charity, and in so many of the other charities with which she was involved. But my principal reason for intervening in this humble address is that I'm the Member of Parliament for Sandown Park, or at least I think that's what she thought I was, by the number of occasions that we met there. Sandown Park, by her own words, was her favourite racecourse, and Sandown Park really loved the Queen Mother on all the occasions that she was there. Whenever she moved from the President's box to award the trophy to the winning jockey and owners, she always made time to speak to everybody and regularly got spontaneous applause. Quite often applause that was joined in by the Leader of the House, who may not have had as many winners as the Queen Mother at Sandown Park, although I'm sure he tipped as many. But nevertheless, she was spontaneously popular with everybody from all walks of life who attended Sandown Park. Sandown Park was actually the racecourse on which she had 79 winners over the years. She won the Whitbread Cold Cup with special cargo in 1984 and another big race 2 years later. It was a very special relationship between the two, but she could be quite a hard taskmaster. On one occasion when we were lunching at a Whitbread Gold Cup, anyone who knows Sandown Park will know that the wind whips right across from the reservoirs up into the stands, and it can be really very cold, even though it's the last weekend of April. On this occasion, I had enjoyed a hearty lunch, and the first race was about to start with the jockeys coming out, and it was indicated that I was to have the honour of sitting first with the Queen Mother out into the open, and I was starting to reach for my very heavy overcoat when the lady-in-waiting looked at me with one of those looks that ladies-in-waiting give when you're about to do something that's not right. And I noticed that the Queen Mother, who was, I can only suggest, dressed in a summer frock, was on her way out and I was to follow. We sat through that race with every jockey, every horse, every bit of history recounted with absolute memory, crisp memory and precision. And I must have increasingly sounded as if I was dumb, not just because I didn't have as much knowledge of racing as the Queen Mother, but I was absolutely frozen to the marrow. She showed no signs of this at all, whether this is because of the Castle of May or other of the Scottish houses in which she inhabited, I do not know. But standing up to go back in was quite an effort on my part, but seemed to have no effect on the Queen Mother herself. This character, that when she was present, nobody was immobile or too worried to do things. She sparked a vitality in the company in which she kept, which was very much part of her own character, a character she shared with others. Sandown Park will long remember her. There is a wonderful equestrian statue of special cargo at Sandown Park. The Queen Mother's spirit will always be beside it.
Cheryl Gillen.
Mr. Speaker, there can be no greater or more fitting tribute to the brilliant life of Her Majesty the Queen Mother than we have heard in the House today. And in adding my support for the humble address, I speak not just for myself and my constituents in Chesham and Amersham, but I am proud as the United Kingdom member of the executive of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association to speak on behalf of its chairman, the Honourable Pius Cinque, the Secretariat, and all our members throughout the Commonwealth's 172 parliaments and legislatures. The Commonwealth Parliamentary Association would like to express its most profound sympathies on the death of Her Majesty. She did not just belong to this country, but was loved and respected throughout the entire Commonwealth, where she travelled extensively. She represented the finest traditions of the monarchy and was noted for her extraordinary warmth and affection by peoples of all nations. She is especially remembered by Commonwealth parliamentarians for her official opening of the 30th Parliamentary Conference held in 1984 in the Isle of Man. The warmth with which she greeted members of the association made a lasting impression on all who attended, and she brought to the conference an air of grace, majesty, and gentleness, which was an inspiration both to the parliamentarians that came to the Isle of Man and also all the Manx people who lined the route to see her. The association was honoured by her presence and is deeply saddened by her passing. The Queen Mother is in death as she was in life, an abiding symbol of all that is good in our world. Her unselfish devotion to duty and country, the depth of her love for her family, and her unfailing sense of humour is her legacy to us all. It is hard to find words that are truly fitting, but Milton wrote many of his beautiful poems in my constituency, and so it is simply to his words that I turn to pay my tribute. Not as you would imagine from Paradise Lost, but from Arcades, a verse of which she could so easily have been the subject. He wrote, "Mark what radiant state she spreads in circles round her shining throne, shooting her beams like silver threads. This is she alone, sitting like a goddess bright in the centre of her light." Mr. Speaker, throughout the Commonwealth, we mourn the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, but her radiance will never be forgotten.
David Burnside. Mr. Speaker, in supporting the humble address, could I recall a day in 1985 that I will never forget? Sir John King, then Chairman of British Airways, thought in late 84 it was quite easy to remember the Queen Mother's birthday next year, 85, so a message was sent through to Clarence House. What would the lady like for her 85th birthday? The message came back, she would like to fly on Concorde. Wanted a bit of excitement. So Concorde was arranged in 1985 and the Queen Mother came to Heathrow. Normal pastel shade, I think I remember it was light blue. 4-inch heels, which I'm told you can't go much higher. Large hat, into seat 1A on Concorde. We had asked her if she required any special requirements for the flight. Sporting Life was ordered. Not for a casual read on the flight, but to make contact with the ground to invest in the horse racing business, which she did from the flight deck. She then had a very, very fine lunch and was invited to the flight deck. Concorde is very small, with a 3-man flight deck, captain, first officer, engineer, and a little jump seat behind the captain. She sat in the jump seat, still with the hat on, about half the width of the flight deck. And then we flew up the Irish Sea. The route had been worked out with the Queen Mother, and we flew over the Castle of May. That's what she wanted on her 85th birthday, to fly on Concorde and fly over the Castle of May. As we flew back south to Heathrow, we had brought representatives from civic life, business life, from all around the United Kingdom. We had filled the aircraft, the 100-seater. And she had been given a brief beforehand who was who on the, so they could be introduced to her. I was lucky enough to be sitting as a director of the company in about row 8. And Sir John King, David Burnside, Director of Public Affairs, and she said, from Northern Ireland. And she said, I pray for Northern Ireland every night. I've never said that publicly before, but I think this House and also the people of Northern Ireland would appreciate knowing that. We've lost a great lady. Peter Pate.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say a few words as one of those constituencies that had no specific connection with the Queen Mother, but where she is just as well loved and well respected as those other constituencies where they have a more direct connection with the Queen Mother. It has to be said that, of course, Lancashire, the Queen Mother is the mother of the present Duke of Lancaster, and of course the wife of the last Duke of Lancaster, loved husband, the King George VI. My first memory of the Queen Mother was when she visited Burnley at the end of the war, when I was taken down as a schoolboy from all the schools went down to see the King and the Queen, as she then was, visit Burnley as we were reaching the conclusion of the Second World War. And I remember that the royal family played a great part during that war and certainly boosted morale of the country. Indeed, the present Queen, as Princess Elizabeth, did deal special speech on the radio to the children of the nation, and every child at school, as we were then, got a certificate at the end of the war from the King. But it was, of course, the very simple things that made her much respected and much loved. And I recall her visit to the city of Manchester when she attended a banquet in either the late 60s or the early 70s. And when I was introduced to her in a group of about a dozen people, each person in that group thought that she was speaking to you alone and nobody else, because she had the knack of speaking in that type of way. But I remember one man that was introduced to her, and she said to him, "I have met you before, haven't I?" And he said, "Yes." And he was just going to say when she had met him, and she said, "Oh, don't tell me." And she carried on chatting for 3-4 minutes, and then she suddenly said, "Did I meet you in Manchester when it was Blitz during the war?" And he said, "Yes, you spoke to me in the cathedral. I was tearing up Manchester Cathedral when it had been bombed the night before, and I was in the ARP." And she had that knack of remembering people, and I've an appalling memory for remembering names and people. But she remembered many years afterwards that she had spoken to that man. The other thing that was the most simple gesture at that dinner, that was a lunch that was attended by some 500 people, with a large number of those people there not particularly pro-monarchy, and indeed some would have been quite clearly Republican. We had all the normal toasts, and the function was drawing to a conclusion. And suddenly, quite unexpectedly, she pushed back her chair and she proposed a toast to the city and the people of Manchester. I have to tell you, that hall of 500 people was electric at that moment, with everybody standing and cheering. And it was those simple, warm gestures, so warmly and genuinely meant by her, that I believe have made her the most respected and warmly loved of all the royal family that we've had. And we do pay tribute to her, and she will be a sad loss to this nation.
Roger Gill. Mr. Speaker, in supporting the Loyal Address, I would like, and I hope I will speak for very many people, to say thank you for the work that Her Majesty the Queen Mother did for so very many charities. I do not propose to go through a litany, I could not go through a litany of them all, but it is, I think, a source of great astonishment for those of us associated with any of them, that she managed to find in such a busy life and such a committed life so much personal involvement in so many organisations to whom she gave such a very great deal. Much has been made this morning, Mr. Speaker, of her commitment to children. When she visited the Royal School for Deaf Children in Margate, she very quickly put at ease her young hosts, with whom some others more shamefully perhaps found difficulty in communicating, and immediately struck a chord with all of them. She was the patron of the Children's Country Holidays Fund. She took a passionate interest in the work that that little organisation does to provide holidays for the underprivileged children of East London. And in this, the final year of her life, she allowed her name to be given to a rose bred specially for her, called the Queen's London's Child. When honourable friends on both sides of this House visit the Chelsea Flower Show this year, you will see the Queen's London Child twinkling in the sun as a living memorial to somebody who the children of the East End of London believe to be a very great lady indeed. They will miss her dreadfully.
Mr. Bottomley. Mr. Speaker, lest it's thought to be an individual quirk of the Father of the House or a one-sided comment, although we can't debate other things today, I think the House and the people of this country will expect the usual channels to arrange a debate at the earliest possible opportunity on the matters he delicately referred to. Can I say that of the 300 organisations that the Queen Mother was associated with, they can't all be listed, but in all of them she was supported by her personal and household staff. In particular, I'd like to mention Sir Martin Gillett, her devoted supporter for very many decades. I saw her in both military and civilian and voluntary service, and I think that, if I can just say so, people don't fully understand or articulate how thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary things, using the inspiration of someone in her position, whether as patron or as colonel or as a supporter of an organisation, can actually achieve extraordinary results. The talk about the East End is not what she herself did alone, but the inspiration she gave to people to put up with hardship or to do that extra bit for those around her. And I think the best tribute is actually to say, can we do more of what she did and what she inspired others to do too?
Mr. Salou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And like many members of this House, I did not actually meet the Queen Mother, and I expect, like most of our constituents, I was not privileged to meet her. We've heard from many colleagues this morning, indeed most movingly from our honourable friend, the member for Mid-Sussex, how he knew her for over 40 years. Yet to me, as to all members of this House, and indeed to all of my constituents, the Queen Mother was a very special lady. She was indeed the nation's favourite granny. And it seems to me that one of her unique gifts was to take the love and the support and the delight that she so clearly took and gave to and from her own family to everyone that she met and came across. And if we, as we go about our business, can just follow her example in some small way of making everyone we meet feel as special as she did, and if we can carry on those small acts of kindness that she performed to all that she knew, we will have served her memory well.
Jeffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the humble address, and on behalf of my constituents in Lagan Valley, I would like to extend my sincere sympathy to Her Majesty the Queen and to the royal family. The month of March 2002 will long be remembered by my constituents as being a month of mixed emotions. Early in March, we had the honour conferred upon the Borough of Lisburn by Her Majesty the Queen in this, her Golden Jubilee year, of city status, and we celebrated the new city of Lisburn. And we especially celebrated in light of our close association with the royal family, with the village of Hillsborough being the official residence of Her Majesty the Queen, and having played host on many occasions to Her Majesty the Queen Mother. And we remember with affection those visits. Indeed, visits, as my friends and colleagues have said, that came at times when the people of Northern Ireland were facing great uncertainty, adversity, with the shadow of violence hanging over our part of the United Kingdom. And so, when the Queen Mother came to visit Northern Ireland, as with other members of the royal family, we took hope from their interest and the time that they spent amongst us. And none the least of the royal family was the Queen Mother and the time that she gave and the affection that she showed for Northern Ireland. And as my colleague, the Honourable Member for South Antrim, has said, we were inspired by her Christian faith and by the fact that she did indeed pray for the people of Northern Ireland. We very much appreciate that. We appreciate the contribution that she made to the life of Northern Ireland and to the life of our nation. And we will mourn her passing greatly. It is at times like this that we are reminded of the contribution that the royal family make to the life of our nation. It is a contribution that many of us in Northern Ireland deeply appreciate, and we will miss the Queen Mother. She was a very special lady, and she meant much to my constituents.
Mr. Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot hope to match the eloquence of a number of those who have contributed before me in this debate, but nevertheless, as a recently elected member of this House, I would like to add a brief tribute of my own to Her Royal Highness, the Queen Mother. She served as the Colonel-in-Chief of a number of regiments in the Army, including the University of London Officer Training Corps and the Royal Anglian Regiment, in both of which I had the privilege to serve. all the people that served in those two regiments, and indeed in all of the armed forces, including in 2 world wars, those that still survive, will greatly mourn her passing. I met her only once when she came to pay a formal visit to London OTC several years ago, and as a young second lieutenant I was deputed to have the honour of introducing her to some of the cadets in the regiment. I freely admit that when I came to this place I was slightly nervous on the day of my maiden speech, but that was as nothing to the butterflies which I was experiencing on the day that she visited London OTC. And I wish to pay tribute to what others have said about her great skill for putting people at ease. When she met me, she put me immediately at my ease and made it very simple for me to perform my duty. And on a personal level, I will always be thankful to her for that. I want, if I may, to conclude with a very gentle story, which some honourable members may have heard before, so I pray their indulgence. But she was asked several years ago, in her 90s, I think, by a journalist, "Your Royal Highness, you have travelled the world. You have met so many people. You have done so many wonderful things. Is there anything at all left to which you still aspire?" To which she reputedly replied, "Yes, I would very much like to receive a telegram from my daughter." And of course she did receive that telegram, and we are all very grateful that she did. I think that Her Royal Highness the Queen Mother was something of an institution in her own right. We are all the poorer for her passing, and as a house and as a nation we will miss her tremendously.
Nicholas Winterton.
Mr. Speaker, a very brief contribution to what has been a most amazing and moving sitting of this House. Yesterday afternoon I was able to attend a reception at the Town Hall in Macclesfield to meet under 18-year-olds, schoolboys who will be playing for England against the under 18 schoolboys from Wales. I should, in fact, in a few moments' time, be there to watch the match. But I felt it appropriate to be here, and I'm so pleased that I am here to share this occasion with all members of the House of all political parties. But that visit to the Town Hall in Macclesfield, when I signed the Book of Condolence with the Mayor and the Leader of the Council, was not moving because we signed the Book of Condolence. It was the many dozens of people, young and old, who were there doing the same thing, and the simple messages that were being put on and in that Book of Condolence. The Queen Mother has held a very special place in the life of our country. She loved its people. She loved this country. She fought for this country, metaphorically speaking, during the war when she refused to leave London. And we all know that she said, "I cannot leave without the children, and I cannot leave without my husband the King, and he will not leave." Her indomitable spirit shone forth then, as it did until last Saturday. But her life was full to the brim of service, of duty, of love, of family, and of her country. She will pass to her place of perpetual peace and rest on a wave of love and affection which will be remembered forever.
Sir Michael Spicer.
Mr. Speaker, I've listened with growing awe to the wonderful tributes that have been given today. And it's because of that I can't understand why it is that her funeral is not to be designated as a state occasion. She was arguably the greatest female British citizen of the 20th century. And I really do hope that those who are responsible for these decisions will reconsider this matter of the status of her funeral.
Order. I will now put the question. The question is that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty, as on the order paper. As many as are opinion say aye. Aye. The country no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Sittings of the House. The question is as on the order paper. As many as their opinions say aye. Aye. Or the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Whip to move the adjournment.
The House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as their opinions say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.